Hey, Kathy, you have such an outstanding record of contribution across so many different domains and interdisciplinary, and you just received this amazing IEEE award for really a lifetime of accomplishment. But you have so many other recognitions, and even things like your students selecting you as a top teacher. I mean, just an incredible background, and I really appreciate you coming in and sharing your insights today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation, and I wouldn't be here where I am today if it wasn't for my students, who have really been amazing to work with.
Well, you definitely, exhibit this idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion, for your entire career. And my audience is really diverse. So there's scientists in there and notable experts, but there are also CEOs and investors and people like this. So it's quite broad. So I'm always curious, and as my audience is as well, is what really contributed to making this wonderful scientist and contributor that you are today, Kathy? I mean, are there one, two, maybe three inflection points? Perhaps it was really early in life or through a mentor, or it could be a series of things. What created this outstanding person?
I think it's really a series of things. I would have to first go back to my parents, who were really amazing. They were both scientists, and my mother was an applied mathematician who worked throughout her life in the through the 60s when I was growing up. And, this was a time when women didn't work. So I had an amazing role model in my mother. I was also very strongly influenced by my advisor, when I started my PhD, as well as other women in the field who were very prominent. I think in particular of Karen Spark Jones, who mentored me in the area of summarization. She was a professor at Cambridge University. And then I think maybe over time, working with my students and wanting to do things that that made them happy, made them feel valued in the world. And I think in particular, when Hurricane Sandy hit New York, this was a time when students wanted to give back, and it started our work on disaster, on developing computational systems to help with disaster.
So that's really an interesting confluence from your family to mentors you've had to your students. That just a broad intermix of enabling you to do the work you do and continue to do. And let's talk about some of the work that you've done in the past. Can you talk about your work in natural language processing? And you're really renowned for your focus on research on the use of data for societal problems. So can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so my interest in natural language processing sort of came together as a result of two interests that I had as an undergraduate. I couldn't decide whether to major in comparative literature or in mathematics. And I didn't know about computer science at that time. I chose comparative literature, but I discovered computer science at the end of my undergraduate, and following my undergraduate was when I learned about natural language processing, which would allow me to bring my two interests together. And that was when I applied for a PhD in computer science at the University of Pennsylvania, where there was a strong focus on natural language processing. I was very thrilled, and I guess this was early 2000s when we did some joint work with faculty from the English department on analyzing novels and identifying social networks within novels. So it sort of brought my two interests. It was full circle back to my roots, essentially.
You know, there's also how you've applied your knowledge of past disasters. There's research about this, seen the lens of media, and provide updates on disasters as they unfold. Can you talk more about that work?
Sure. So as I mentioned, I was motivated to begin this work when Hurricane Sandy came through and hit New York, and many of the students were really interested in thinking about how they could give back to the community. Some of them had been personally impacted. And at that point in time, we had already developed a system called News Blaster, which could summarize news on a daily basis, where essentially similar in many ways to Google News. But that was very early times, and we had developed an approach where it could identify events of the day, multiple articles that were reporting on those events, and could generate a summary that synthesized information from multiple articles on a single event. And we had looked at we use this as a platform for research, so different kinds of research that would take place there. And one thing that seemed particularly interesting would be to be able to take an event which was occurring at that point in time and looking at how it unfolds over time, and for each day to be able to give an update on what had happened over the day before. And so we looked at this within the context of the disaster, to be able to provide updates from news that was coming in on what was new today, what did we know today, or actually, even in that system, we were looking hour by hour. What did we know in this hour that we didn't know in the hour before? As it happened, there was some interest, sort of, I guess, internationally in this topic at that point in time, and there was a competition essentially for researchers who were working in this area, and so we participated in that.
You know, I do quite a bit of work with different UN agencies. Some of them are actually bigger than what we think of the UN itself. The one out of New York, bigger budgets. The World Food Program, for example, you know, they have something like 100 aircraft, 30 ships, 8,000 trucks, maybe about 20 to 24,000 staff globally. They would make use of this kind of signaling system. Have you worked with different UN agencies like the Rothschild program or others?
We have not. We did this as a research project. So our News Blaster system we did have up and running on the web for years. And we did incorporate in that the ability to provide update summaries, but not the ones specifically about disaster. I think that, you know, that could be a good kind of thing going forward. It requires a certain amount of work that is not research in order to deploy a system. And so I think, you know, given that I'm working with PhD students, this is why we stopped at this point in time.
Right. I guess you're really talking about the translational research aspect of, you know, to make deployable. Well, since my audience also consists of entrepreneurs, they should look at the body of work and deploy them in global solutions. You know, I can see this then being founded on your earlier work, where you led a team of development on the development of a system for personalized search and summarization over medical literature. Can you talk about that work?
Sure. That was an interdisciplinary project. It was between computer science and biomedical informatics, as well as physicians in the medical school at Columbia. And so there we were particularly interested in how we could personalize and make available information on a personalized basis to both physicians and patients and their families. So on the physician side, we thought, well, we actually have, I mean, one of the hardest things when you're developing a personalized system is how do you get information about the end user? So if we want to personalize for the physician, information that the physician is seeking to help in treatment of their patients, how do we personalize that, tailor it for the patients that the physician is treating? And we thought, well, actually we have at the medical school the patient record, which Columbia was one of the earlier leaders in establishing an online patient record. And so we actually have a large amount of information about the patient, their characteristics, their diagnosis, their course of treatment, and we could use those characteristics to help us to find journal articles that were more appropriate for the particular patient under the physician care. And so that's sort of how we started off. We had, having a team where we could draw on the expertise of physicians in the hospital. We could design the system. We could work to design the system that better met their needs. We also, at that point in time, looked at developing a similar approach for patients, where we would want to be able to provide information that was accessible to the lay population. And again, that was especially targeted towards their needs at that point in time.
Again, so I can just see the utility of this across all of the different sort of domains that I'm in. So really foundational work. I know in your current work on social media analysis, you work with interdisciplinary researchers, and it's really fascinating and involves social work and linguistic and psychiatry, and you're analyzing posts involving Black communities. So can you talk more about this project of identifying and understanding digital expressions of Black grief?
Yeah, so again, we're very motivated by the events of our time. Actually, I had been working with my collaborator, the faculty member from social work, his name is Desmond Patton, for multiple years before we started this project. But we were particularly concerned with how the Black community has been hit by or traumatized by events, both with COVID or with violence and police brutality. That's not exactly the right word, but with problems along those lines. So when we worked together before, we have a very nice sort of collaboration. The social work team is very interested in doing what they call a qualitative analysis of online social media posts. And so we're looking here actually at two ways of gathering those posts. One, we're looking at online forums, but we're also have developed our own platform where people can write about the experiences that they have been through. And the social work team does this qualitative analysis, which is to be able to identify the different emotions that people are experiencing and the events that have triggered those emotions. And given their background and familiarity with the community, they can provide a contextual understanding of why, these people may be experiencing what they are. We also have a linguist on the team, and her expertise, her name is Jessie Greiser, and she has just moved to University of Michigan. Her expertise is in African American English, so looking at the specific linguistic expressions that are used. And then we also have a psychiatrist on the team, Kathy Shear, who's at Columbia, and her expertise is in grief, the different stages of grief and how people experience it. So, given this group, we have the potential to create a corpus of expressions, posts that people have written with layered annotations, which represent the meanings, the context in which people have had the experience, the particulars of the linguistic expressions that they use to express their grief or their stance on particular topics. And then Kathy Shear will do interviews with people so that we get who have posted, so that we get more background about why they were feeling the way they were doing. And this gives us a very rich representation from which we can learn how to develop a system that can automatically detect when people are experiencing grief or have gone through traumatic events. And one thing that I would note about our model is that we are focusing on developing a computational model of African American English. And this has been something that I think has been lacking within the natural language community, where the focus is on very large language models, which draw on mixed communities on the web, but are primarily, I would say, standard American English.
Again, that's a really, really fascinating work, especially when you hear about, I could see the implications of what you're doing on the diversity, equity, inclusion side, because there's these very large language models, Godel from Microsoft, Lambda from Google, GPT-3 from the Open AI group, and so on, or DALL-E 2, which has been applied to the art arena. What are your thoughts on that as these models become much bigger and bigger, using like diffusion techniques or transformers and so on? What are your views on that, and then the implications of your work with these very large models that are out there?
Well, there's no doubt that these very large language models have been quite successful. We see dramatic improvements in a lot of the tasks that we address in the natural language community. So summarization, which is clearly an area that I work in, has seen tremendous progress with the use of these large language models. But I think people are, discovering problems with bias in these language models. They're sometimes hard to control, so it's possible that, they produce output that is unintended. For example, in their use in summarization systems, we sometimes see that the summary contains information which did not occur in the input article, sort of just appeared there. um, and people are working on these problems, so I have no doubt that there will be progress in addressing them. But the problem of bias and developing models that are tuned, for specific populations and, which may not, I'm sorry, my dog is barking. Do you mind if I hold on? I'll put him up on the sofa so he stops. Sorry, hold on just a second. Okay, hopefully that will stop it. Yeah, so the problem of bias is really something that has come out more recently, and that people are looking at more seriously. It's a difficult problem because when these language models are trained on huge amounts of data, and to get that kind of data, we're often gathering texts that date back years, and stereotypes are embedded in that text, and it can be hard to tease them out. I will also think of my collaborator Desmond pointed out an article at one point in time, which was somewhat eye-opening, which talked about the impact on people of color who communicate with the dialogue systems, and they don't speak their language. And how does that feel to have to communicate when you want to make use of technology, to have to change your language to be able to be understood? How does that make you feel as far as being included in a community? So I think it's very important that we develop language models that can understand and even ultimately generate in dialects that are not standard American English.
Again, because there's just so much work in this, and there's an attempt, or there's just maybe some feelings that perhaps the large language models can get more generalized in their capability. Do you think that's going to happen? So it's not so narrow, and it's this whole aspect of AGIA, artificial general intelligence. Do you see that moving in that direction? And then that'll maybe, if we can eliminate the bias, or reduce the risks associated with bias, where it becomes more generalized in its applications to various areas? Or do you think it's just not going to go there? What are your thoughts on that?
I think people are definitely looking at it. I think it's it's an important topic right now, and there's a lot of focus on bias and ethics in the AI community. It is more recent, and I think it takes some time after a model comes out to realize what the problems may be. You need to use it in over a period of time. And these technologies are evolving very rapidly. It's very rapid. So being able to discover what has happened, it has to happen in a very short period of time. I think there will be focus, and there is focus on how to address these ethical questions with large language models. How it evolves, I'm not sure. Will we have multiple models that you use in different situations? There are approaches which develop sort of mitigations that are inserted. So you have one general model, and there are mitigating techniques that are within it. These are questions, and we have yet to see how it will evolve.
If I can get you to look into sort of like your crystal ball of where things are going to evolve in your research, Where do you see that trending? What are some questions that you have in your mind that you want to put some attention to, maybe in next year or in 2025 or afterwards, that you think, that's an interesting area and I really want to focus some energy in these areas? Can you talk about it now or not?
Yeah, I can talk about it. We have some projects that were very early on, which are actually related to, some of what we've been talking about now, but little different spin. So one project which we are starting on now is looking at cross-cultural understanding. And so we're looking at when you have communication between people who come from two different cultural backgrounds, who speak different languages, when does communication break down? How can we detect when people are not really understanding each other, perhaps because they use different communication norms? And so can we follow a conversation and between people from two different cultural backgrounds and identify when the communication is heading towards failure or when it's heading towards success? So that, I haven't talked about this here, but I have done a fair amount of work in multilingual research where we do work in different languages. And again, that's important in the global world to help people from different cultural backgrounds who speak different languages be able to communicate with each other. So that is one direction. Another direction, which I think is important, we've been looking at misinformation from different points of view. Obviously a goal is to be able to identify when misinformation appears. And so we have done some work on fact checking, for example, with information about COVID that might appear in the news. But we're also looking at sort of whether we can identify intentions behind misinformation. For example, whether it was accidental or whether it was intentional, for different kinds of reasons. So that's another topic. I am also really interested in, there's a little bit of this in the IEEE award on analyzing personal narrative. And I mentioned about our work on identifying social networks within novels. We have done recent work on summarization of novels, and this is quite hard. In fact, I think it's, can be hard even for people to commit to that area because it's such a difficult topic. But I really like working on difficult topics. And so I am hopeful that I will have some students who will be interested in working on this with me going forward.
That's really, really fascinating, all these different elements that you're looking at. And I can see it touch points to some of the work that I do in the business area, right? So, and across CEOs, the UN, excuse me, the UN and so on. Again, fascinating. Are there any outlier kind of topic areas that you're kind of thinking of, but maybe not so mainstream to the work you're doing, that you think are really interesting and you're curious about? Maybe you do some additional reading in the area, though your research may not touch on it. It could be things like consciousness, or it could be things like climate. I don't know. Whatever, that's why I call it not within the scope of your work, but on the fringes or on the outlier areas where you're curious and you're follow some of that work. Or supercomputing, perhaps, exascale, or already out, or quantum computing, etc.
I'm a very focused person. I've come to realize that over the years. If we look at what I've worked on from when I started my PhD in 1982, which was on generating text, paragraph length text, something that people weren't doing at that point in time, to where I am now with generating paragraph length summaries. You know, you can see the theme has remained throughout the years. So you know, where I've gone in directions that don't fall into that have been more in analysis of social media, which I can imagine, you know, that also doesn't answer your question, because it's also has to do with natural language processing. There is some interesting work now, which I've begun to become aware of, and people at Columbia are working in this area on studying the brain and how functions in the brain correspond to how we produce language, and when we, so sort of the intersection between those two fields. I know very little about it at this point, but it, you know, that's an area that looks interesting to me. I have worked in the past in areas of sustainable energy. So with people in the climate groups at Columbia, or looking at how we can change behavior of people in regard to conserving energy through messaging. That was, I feel that was a hard area for us to do research in. You know, it's hard to have the kind of data that we wanted to be able to do something really novel. So yeah, there are some areas, but I'm very focused.
Clearly, and making, you know, tremendous contributions as a result. And you know, Kathy, you've done a lot of work as a pioneer, you know, building ecosystems for women and supporting women. So let's sort of get to that area. I mean, you were the first woman to receive tenure at Columbia School of Engineering and Applied Science in 1989. What was that like? What were the how did you master those challenges at that time?
Well, it was a different world when I first joined the School of Engineering and Applied Science. I was actually there was another woman who was there for a while, but she was not there the whole time. So there were quite a few periods of time when, you know, I would go to faculty meetings for the school, and it would be a sea of men in sort of black, you know, suits, and then me. So, you know, I definitely felt different in that time. Having the first other woman join the department, which happened, I don't know, maybe 3 years or so after I joined, made a tremendous difference to me. Just having one other woman in the room, I felt helped a lot. And, you know, noticing that makes me notice what could help undergraduates and graduate students as they go through. Certainly having a critical mass of women, of having somebody else who you can talk to. There is this theory that when you're in a meeting and a woman says something, it may be ignored, and later on a man will pick up the same topic and repeat it, and it will be responded to. I certainly have experienced that, but I think when you have multiple women in the room, that's less likely to happen. And I think for undergraduates in particular, you really need to have a cohort and people who think like you, who you can go to, and who you can talk with, and who you can be open with. And so, yes, I have worked to support that.
Yeah, and I guess this relates to you supported the establishment of the Columbia's Women in Computer Science group, and you're serves as department chair, and it's a pretty large group. You know, you got what, more than 100 undergraduate and graduate students, and you strive for strong representation of women with PhDs in your group or in the PhD group. And I thought was a really interesting stat that, you know, roughly 45% of your graduate PhDs have been women, so more than double the national average. Can you talk about that journey of forming that group, and maybe there's some stories that you can share about that process and, and where it is today, and so on?
Yeah, I have to think a little bit about what I can say. But yeah, when I was chair, it was an undergraduate woman who came to me and said she was interested in forming this group, Women in Computer Science, and would I support it? And I said, definitely, yes. So this was an effort that came about from the Students Initiative. I was There were several things that surprised me when it started. The first was and here's where I think it's important to have senior women in the room, and I've seen that, you know, for my own impact. But when I went to the faculty to say that, you know, there were undergraduate women who were interested in forming this group in Women in Computer Science, and I thought, you know, there would be nothing but support for that. And I found a surprising amount of questions about that, about, you know, why was this needed, and would men be excluded, and, you know, all sorts of things like this. And there, of course, I think, you know, the men in the department are very supportive of this group, particularly as it has grown, and we've been able, you know, it's been able to accomplish quite a bit. But at that beginning point in time, I saw how important it was to have someone senior who could shield the undergraduates from the kinds of reaction, the initial reaction that came back, and that I could argue for them, and, you know, that we could go forward. So, you know, that also indicates sort of the importance of, for bringing younger people in, of having more senior women there to support them. That group has been run by students and grown by students. It's really been remarkable. They're very passionate about what they do, and it provides career advice. It provides, you know, panels for what kinds of careers, for how to navigate going through the undergraduate and graduate program. It provides social events for them to get together. We have networking events each year. It really, I think, has been very important for supporting the women in the department and the growth of the number of women in the department. For my own group, I do look for, you know, for people who are applying and who are coming in, and I think about the balance of my group. And you know, each year I think about the number of women and the number of men I have, and of course, you know, I am always looking for the best to join. But if you look, you can sometimes, if you look in places where you don't expect, you can find the best, but it does require paying attention. So yeah, I've had some years. I'm coming out of a period of time. I had in the past, like 5 years or so, I had 5 women and 2 men in my group. Now I'm going back. I have more men right now. I think I have about 4 men and 3 women right now. So, you know, the balance changes, and at different points in time it will be differently, but it is something that I pay attention to.
You have so much experience and wisdom, collective wisdom from the communities you worked with, and then from the span of your research, because it's so far-reaching. Can you share some insights? What are some of the attributes that you think make for a research success, or maybe that's just too hard of a question to answer?
No, there are things I can say about it. I think a big thing that it takes is determination. The most successful students that I have are those who are really driven. I want to say aggressive in their approach to research, although I know aggressive is sometimes viewed as a negative word. But they really they really take it upon themselves to push themselves each and every day, and they don't take no for an answer. And they're willing to put huge amounts of effort in.
Do you find that there's sort of a real innate curiosity beyond their field, or do you find they're very focused in a particular area?
It depends on the student. That can vary. It can be either way. I have some students who are interested in a number of different things and will essentially like move from one project to another. There's a theme usually between them. As a PhD student, you really want to have a theme because you want to have something coherent in the end. And then and in contrast, there are those who are really focused. So I think it's just, a matter of personal taste on that.
Do you find your graduate students, by and large, continue then into research and academia, or a small percentage, maybe 10%, 20%, maybe it's larger, like say, you know what, I want to go into industry, I want to work for some of the tech companies out there or other companies, and some maybe entrepreneurial, where they want to form their own companies. Do you have kind of a sense of what the numbers are roughly on that?
I would say more students go into industry than into academia. I've graduated, so I did this count a couple of years ago, so it's slightly out of date. At that point, I had graduated 37 students, and 14 of them had gone into academia. So slightly less than half.
Are there any other areas? So, we cover the span of the different areas that have occupied your interest, research interest, your contributions to enabling more women access and support and so on. Are there other areas that you want to talk about that we missed so far in our chat?
In my work, you mean?
It could be any topic now. Your work plus activities outside of your work.
I do have activities outside of my work. I'm not all about work. So my biggest passion is sailing. I have just come back from a 3-week sailing trip where we sailed from the end of Long Island to Maine and back, and hit some pretty wild weather along the way. So this is my other passion in life, is sailing. Going back to work though, I do find, one of the things I like about being at a university is that you can shift your focus at different points in time. I could focus more on research. I could focus more on teaching. I could focus on service. And, at different points in time, I have gone in these different directions. So for example, I spent about 3 years where I led the Commission on the Status of Women at Columbia, and our focus during those 3 years was on passing parental workload relief. Before that parental workload relief, there was only the basic maternity leave, which was a 6-week disability leave. That took quite a bit of work in working at all levels of the administration. It had to be passed through the University Senate, but the different deans of the different schools had to be on board. The president of the university had to be on board. And I learned a lot during that period, like how can you get a university to change? You know, what does it take to get a university to change? And the fact that we did change, there was a lot of resistance in the beginning, and it took a lot of work to get that through. And I'm actually quite proud of that accomplishment. It's impacted a lot of people since it went through.
Well, that's a significant contribution. And I just have 2 more buckets of questions. So this next one is just about the awards you won and you know what they mean to you and which ones for various reasons. And you can maybe just highlight one or more, or you know, just give your viewpoints. But I'll list them, some of them, for the audience so they're aware.
Can I interrupt for just a second? Because there's one other aspect which I should have answered to your previous question. And that is that in recent years, I have become an Amazon scholar, and I've been working at Amazon, which I started during my sabbatical, and I wanted to do it so I would see the environments that my students would have when they graduated. And that's really enabled me to see a different part of the field and how people work, and has been quite interesting.
Yeah, in fact, that's really fascinating, because you've had and you continue to have many key roles at your school and with the community as well. So, and I encourage the audience to look at your extended profile. That's part of the interview. It's just fascinating, all the work that you've done. I'm just going to detail some of the awards you've won, and then we'll spend a few minutes talking about that, and then finally end with some recommendations that you want to give to the audience. So first of all, just some of the awards. There's just so many. You know, you received honors and recognition from the American Academy of Arts and Science, an elected member, the American Philosophical Society member, American Associate of Artificial Intelligence fellow, a fellow within the Association for Computing Linguistics, in fact, a founding fellow, and also with the Association of Computer Machinery, which I'm part of that organization. And then early on, you received the National Science Foundation Presidential Young Investigator Award and National Science Foundation Faculty Award for Women. You've got a Columbia Great Teacher Award, the Anita Borg Women of Vision Award, and this latest one, which is the reason I'm interviewing you, from an invitation from the IEEE Awards Group, and that is the 2023 IEEE Innovation and Societal Infrastructure Award. So, and there's just so many accolades and recognition of what you've done. Do you want to make a comment on what that feels like to be awarded, or you want to single out any of them, or I guess just you have an open mic, so to speak, of how you want to talk about the awards you won?
Well, it certainly feels like an honor. I feel very honored to have received these. I think the one that probably, well, there are 2 that are probably most meaningful to me, and I received them both in the same year. One was the Anita Borg Women of Vision Award, Women of Vision Award. I like being honored, you know, by a group like that. But I also liked, you know, sort of the the specific award, Woman of Vision, to be, it's not something that, you know, I would have really been able to say about myself that, you know, that I was a woman of vision. It's like, it's just too, you know, I couldn't imagine being worthy of something like that. So it really meant a lot to me, and coming from that community, it meant a lot to me. I very much enjoyed the award ceremony. It was a large audience of young women. And I think they were high school age as well as undergraduates. So, you know, you had a lot of women coming up to you afterwards. And I always enjoy talking with young women. I love to be able to give advice, you know. So that award was very meaningful to me. And another one that was the Columbia's Great Teacher Award, which comes from the students. And again, because that comes from the students, you know, it feels particularly meaningful. I do think you know, I am very passionate about helping the students. I love working with the students. I love working with them at all levels, and, you know, graduate, undergraduate, and the students that we have at Columbia are just so amazing. I often feel, you know, I learn from them. They are so smart and really, you know, just so special. So to receive an award like that was also very meaningful to me.
Well, you know, you're talking about it with such passion that it's inspiring. So I thank you for that, for sharing that narrative. And this is my final question, but I'm going to set it up in that you are the Henry and Gertrude Rothschild Professor of Computing Science at Columbia University, the founding director of the Data Science Institute, serving as director from 2012 to 2017. You mentioned the Amazon Scholar, which you are. You served as department chair from 1998 to 2003, as a vice dean for research for the School of Engineering and Applied Science from 2010 to 2012, and then, of course, your PhD work at University of Pennsylvania in computing or computer and information sciences. So that gives the added sort of context. And my last question is, based on everything we talked about today, what are your recommendations for the audience?
Oh, that's a big question. I guess my recommendation for the audience, I would have two kinds of recommendations. One is for the younger people in the audience, that to pursue your passion, do what you love, and enjoy your work. So pick something that you enjoy. I have really enjoyed my work over the years. And then I guess for the broader audience is just, I think now is the time when natural language processing has had a huge impact and has the possibility for far more impact going forward. And I enjoy seeing it. I encourage efforts in all areas where it can touch, whether it's more on the business side, but also on the societal side, where we can make a strong impact to help humanity.
Well, I can see definitely the work that you do for the benefit of Earth's ecosystems, which includes humanity. So thank you so much, Kathy, for coming in today. You just have an outstanding, amazing career, and your contributions still are felt worldwide and will continue for some time. Thank you for sharing your insights, your wisdom, your experiences, your narratives and stories with our audience.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to the brand called You Videocast and Podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the brand called You.